And we're back. And our guest today is Margo Giles, who's
Yes,
goes by the spelling of two different names, which is like that's like Madonna-esque. When
it
you
is
say
very Madonna-esque. I
when you
love that.
say when you say Margo, it's like everyone knows who you are, and having two spellings is like it's like Prince.
Yeah, I mean, although I think mine are close enough where we're not going off the rails here with the naming convention.
No, no, not at all. So, Marco, you're the CEO of Irys Cloud, and we're going to be spending time talking about you and Irys and the changes that you're doing. For starters, I always like to give the guests an opportunity for a little bit of an elevator pitch. Who, besides being the Madonna of insurance, who is Margo Giles?
Oh my gosh, like that's like, isn't that a loaded question though?
Mhm.
Like, who are you?
Purposely.
And I actually just wrote a whole thing about this, about not like tying your career to like your personal identity. And then I'm gonna go right into this conversation with you and talk about my career being my personal identity.
Well,
Um,
let's talk about your personal identity.
Yeah. I mean,
How-
really, for many years there was really not a difference between work and identity. But I have a collection of oddities that I do. You know, I read, I do puzzles. I love puzzles. I'm obsessed with them. And outside of that, I am a workaholic. I just when I get like invested in something, like I must see it through. Like I'm just one of those people that like probably not even in a good way. There's probably a little bit of work that needs to go into that with a therapist, but like I just don't like it bothers me. So like have you ever like watched a show or a movie and like you forget like how it ended or the name of it and you like you sit there and you're like god, what is the name of that movie that I watched and you can't think of it? Like that is the kind of thing that will drive me fully bananas until I figure it out. So like I segue that into solving the problems or like getting obsessed with something. Like if I can't solve it, like I just won't stop until I do. Even if it's like, what are we on, year 8 of building an AMS? Right, because I wanted to fix that problem. So I think, yeah, I think that would be a really indicative, more like Margo the person instead of Margo the CEO of Irys.
I think they call that tenacity.
It's a little
Good,
tenacity. Yeah, I like
good,
that.
good, good skill set to have. You're up in the Tampa, Florida area. Are you a native Floridian?
I am, and I'm a native tampon. I said that on the if you've ever heard that. Like Central South Florida, where like Orlando, Tampa, Miami, we tend to be like transient. It's a city that people move
Yeah.
to either when they retire or kind of college age. You know, that's another big time for people to move down here. So no, I'm native, and actually, I went to the same high school as my mother, and we had the same Spanish teacher. So, and I think my great great grandparents moved here and on one side, so I've been here for many generations, and on the other side, they immigrated from Greece in the 30s and moved here in a part of Tampa that's very Greek. So yeah, I'm a native.
Wow. So I always feel like there's more layers to the onion here. We just keep peeling them back. I listened to you on a prior podcast, and listen, it's kind of obvious, like you have like an entrepreneurial attitude, right, to you, but then you dig a little bit deeper and you realize like you've touched like a bunch of stuff. You're not just like an insurance chick, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you've touched a bunch of stuff. And the one that like leapt off the page, but also the interview was Zingo. You
I knew
were
this.
you, you were doing Uber something Uber style, but like in a really, really interesting way. And I like dug into that and I was like, wow, not only is that like a great idea, like the execution of that is was marvelous. I can see your tenacity in that. Before we jump into Iris,
Yeah,
right,
sure.
and talk about like your tenacity and what it is you're trying to accomplish with Iris, to give people a flavor of like who you are as an entrepreneur, can you talk about Zingo a little bit? Because that's just such an interesting story.
Yeah, I mean, so the founder of Zingo was another, just like me, a college grad. He was in Atlanta and we had mutual friends or something because I was at Tallahassee at Florida State at the time. And the minute I saw it, I was like, I like, this is yes, because
It's
I think all
another
of us,
puzzle for you.
it was another puzzle. Well, the problem here, and I think I've said this too before as well, which is like, I will go the extra mile if I feel like there's something altruistic tied to it, especially that really helps sort of fuel the vision for me. And, you know, drunk driving, I was in college. We had all
Hmm.
known somebody that had been hurt by it or that had gotten a DUI. And in our sphere, you know, we had lost a friend in that regard. And so it was always one of those things that made a lot of sense to me. Like I was always I was like the mother hen. I was the uncool mother hen when we would go out, like collecting everyone's keys and making sure like, just crash here. You don't need to drive, all that. But really there was just a big hurdle with my friend group to getting people to either not drive. And a lot of it was surrounding the fact that it was the next day they had class, or, you know what I'm saying? There was something they had to do with their vehicle, and they really didn't want to leave the car behind. And so that was to me, that was the biggest driver. And you guys have to remember, this was a long time ago.
Hmm.
So there was no Uber. And for most of us that living outside of the Northeast, the United States, there was no public transportation. And certainly there was taxis weren't
Right.
even really a big thing. So even if you you were either carpooling to the bar or going out, you know, and then you had that one person that was going to drive home, or, you know, or that was really your only option at that point. So for me, it was like, okay, this is the thing that's stopping us from having like a fun, safe time where no one has to go through this again. Why don't we try to fix the problem? So when I saw Zingo, I immediately went to Atlanta. It was really, really small, and worked with the CEO there to bring it to other cities. And so I started taking it and franchising it out to other cities. And I did that for a very long time. But Zingo was a wild thing to build, because it was like, once again, kind of a foray into something that no one had ever done before.
Hmm.
So the way it worked was you would call us and we would come on scooters. So like now that's not nowadays you see the bird scooters, like their scooters are kind of everywhere. This was like not, no one had ever seen these things before. And we got the scooters from this manufacturer in Italy, and they folded up real small, and then we would put the scooter in the trunk of the car and we'd drive everyone home in their car at their house, and then we'd take the scooter out and go to the next ride. So if you think about it, there was the mechanics of it, of building that business, were like, it was a big nut to crack. There was, you know, scheduling, and we ended up building some software for like mapping routing and like routing calls and like routing calls to drivers in certain locations. And there was a lot of software that had not existed. Think of what you used with Uber, that we had to build and utilize. And so there a lot of, I think, what I learned in Zingo kind of over like that same operational mindset of using technology to solve a problem that was ancient or that had a legacy solution but wasn't really functioning properly. There's a lot of parallels between Zingo and Irys in that way.
Yeah, and it ultimately got sold to
Yeah,
Anheuser-Busch,
correct.
which
Yep.
is a perfect fit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Folks that might get inebriated at bars, right? Probably maybe drinking Anheuser-Busch, right? And
Yes.
Anheuser-Busch brings a solution to the table. So that's phenomenal. But you got experience, you said technology. So you got experience with disparate paradigms,
Yeah.
right? And saying, what's it going to take to kind of solve this one little thing? And so now I want to bring it back to the agency system.
Yeah.
And before we go into like the problems that agents have, you were an agent,
Yeah.
right? So you got to see it. Can you just give your insurance background a little bit?
Yeah.
How did you get into insurance? And I want to kind of converge to what leads up to Irys.
Yeah. So we were doing, believe it or not, with Zingo, a lot of Zingo was risk mitigation. Like, if now that I'm looking back at what we were
Hmm.
doing, there was two big parts of running Zingo outside of the ops side, which is, again, I'll get to that in the insurance, but it was creating a movement. Like there was a lot of like change in behavior with Zingo. Like we had to change people's behavior there. And so like a lot of that kind of moved over into insurance, when we talked a lot about going to the bars and restaurants and explaining to them what the bar and restaurants risk was like by leaving vehicles in the parking lot overnight, by having people drive drunk off of the property. Like they knew the problems, but they didn't have the solution. And so it was funny because when I was like rope-a-doped into insurance. When I ended up in insurance, it was like, oh, I've already, like, this is very similar to how I pitched Zingo to bars and restaurants and clubs, which is like, hey, you're doing this behavior. I want you to have a good time. Like, keep doing the things you're doing, but can we be safe about it? And then it was just a really easy switch in my brain to selling that into selling insurance. And it was funny because with Zingo, we actually, a lot of the more technical side of insurance came from the fact that it was difficult for us to get insured as a company. Like you can imagine me pitching what we do as a company to an insurance agent
Sure. Yeah.
and them
Yeah.
going, are you
What?
insane? And so we worked with two large carriers to try to create a program for, I mean, it took us a while because when we were really small and we only had a couple locations, they were all like, whatever. But when we got larger and more serious and the location started to grow, then we were able to put an insurance program together for that company. So like that part was always really exciting to me. And I think that altruism transferred because yes, I could go and I was great at sales and I could go create a movement but like at the end of the day, I was still protecting people and still really almost advocating on their behalf in a system that they don't really understand. And so I think that move to insurance was actually pretty seamless.
Yeah. Most people say they fall into it. I've never heard someone say they got rope-a-doped.
The new term going in it, rope-a-doped into insurance. Well, I mean, no one was like, no one, I mean, now it's actually not the truth, but I know Florida State has a really big risk program. But back then that wasn't really, it wasn't a career path that you would go into that it was widely, it was a very salesy type career.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
insurance is a family business
Yeah.
for you. Your husband is still
And my
on
mother.
the and your mother is still on the agency brokerage side of things.
Yes. Yeah. Very
Okay.
much so.
Okay. So now we're tying the pieces together. So you're an entrepreneur and you operated in the agency system. So you sold insurance, you had to manage claims and all of
All
those
the
other
stuff.
stuff. Okay. So I don't think a lot of people understand how agencies work, the operations, and I think some of the folks that will listen to this podcast because it's going to be mostly Florida oriented, although we'll share it in other channels as well because it's Florida oriented. There's there's something unique about the agency system, especially with technology. Can you talk a little bit about the frustrations that you had as an agency operator with technology?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm going to date myself a little bit because when I really started diving into insurance, this was probably 15 or so years ago. And so if you put think about where we were 15 years ago to where we are
Yeah.
now, insurtech was literally just becoming a thing at that point in time. We were just starting to see some software roll out that was specific for insurance, specifically the agent and broker side of insurance. I mean, there's always been tech available for huge companies like Progressive and State Farm and Nationwide,
Mhm.
but not necessarily for the independent agent or that distribution channel. So we were, and me to back up, I was primarily in the commercial P&C space, and I wasn't independent, so I wasn't captive. So if you start to stacking the chips there, independent in Florida, commercial lines, and then writing not just SMB commercial, but like construction and you
Mhm.
know what I mean? Like so we were dealing with the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst scenarios as far as like the process you had to go through. So, if you're in the Midwest or especially at that time, you're an independent agent, you got some direct carrier appointments, you've got your 5 or 6. In Florida, it's like we're going through the E&S market. We've got wholesalers and brokers we
Yeah.
have to go, so like our chain, or sort of like the value chain that I was experiencing from being an agent on the very front end to all the intermediaries that I needed to work with and through to write a large commercial policy in Florida. was so incredibly manual. And in some, like, I still remember doing like triple carbon copy paper, right? Like, and I think Lindsay, my co-founder, joked she had a floppy disk that she had to quote bonds on, right? So like it was a really just very antiquated process, even for 15 years ago. And I'm sure even now, that if you still look at that subsector of insurance, there's not a lot of
Yeah,
software going into that as either, which is crazy to me.
yeah, you're not just going onto a portal and spending 15 minutes to get 15% discount. Like you literally have to shotgun a whole bunch of markets like every single time, every year,
Right.
right? Like it just over and over and
Well, and
over
think of the
again.
data, like, you got a $2 or $3 million trucking fleet. Like that takes, do you know, like I'm talking to risk compliance, OSHA. I'm most likely going on site in some of these scenarios. Like the amount of data that as an agent we have to collect to get to write those kinds of risks, and then to not have a place to put that data except for like a form, right? That's like it's just all the whole thing was broken. And then back then, that form was faxed, mailed, like, what, you know what I'm saying? Like there was no customer portal. There's still no customer portals for you to go through and quote large commercial risk,
Yeah.
which
So
is
you
crazy because if you think about like like how much premium is actually written for that sector of insurance, like much of the premium on P&C it comes through these mid to large commercial policies.
Yeah. And so you're sitting in between customers and clients, insurance buyers,
Yep.
and the markets, and you have to deal with multiple markets. So you brought up E&S, London, right? Like you have to shotgun this thing. And so the network effect means that I like the triple carbon paper. It means that you have to manage multiple pieces of communication to
Yes.
actually understand where an account is at any moment in time, right? So it's a CRM problem,
Yeah.
right? That then goes into you got to manage the actual insurance. So the relationship with the carrier, there could be something wrong with the payment, a claim occurs, right? You have to
Mm-hmm.
create an endorsement, like they get a new vehicle, you have to
Yep.
create an endorsement. So there's that back and forth. So the amount of back and forth that's occurring at your style of agency is just insane,
Yeah.
right? And you didn't have a system to manage it. It was probably done in like you had a separate CRM and you're probably managing things in Excel and you have these disparate systems. But there's another issue as well, and you brought this up in the podcast that I listened to, which is about the data model
Yeah.
and the ability to collect data. And I thought I had never really thought about it that way, but for anyone that's listening, right? When you talk to your agent's basically following like a questionnaire,
Yeah.
and you brought up something about personality types around these people, like do these people skydive? Do they, what are their hobbies? What are like you in the paradigm you're talking about, you almost don't even have time to be able
Yeah.
to do that. But those are necessary questions. Can you shed a little bit of light on, I know you kind of tackle these problems like dominoes, one by one by one by one,
Yeah.
but shed light on the opportunity as you saw it, or not the brokenness of what you
Yes.
saw and how it's like I have to do something about this because no one else is.
Well, because if you think about like insurance in general, I've always said is it's like, and there are people that will fight me on this, but it's not transactional. I think after a certain point, it's really not a fast transactional sale. And I get really frustrated with the industry as a whole because they're pushing everything towards this quickly buy insurance. And I'm like, I don't know if this is the type of product. Like I want to trust, I need as a consumer,
Yeah.
I need to trust. I'm not going to give you money for some future event that may or may not happen and hope that you show up without some level of trust, right? And I think we keep pushing people in this like quickly, quickly, quickly. And that shows itself when someone calls in for insurance and you're a robot and all you're talking to them about are the things that the bare minimum that you need to get them an insurance quote. And you're not building personal rapport. You're not building any genuine connection if you're following that script. It's like, hey, oh, you want insurance? Okay. Let's talk about your property. You got a pool? Is it fenced? All of these things, like none of that matters really to the human being that you're speaking to. And what I saw in the systems and the way that I sold was I developed rapport. So those questions that you're talking about, like, hey, are you local? Where do you live? Oh, my friend lives in that neighborhood. Do you know them? Oh, your kid goes to the Y. My kid goes to the Y. Like all of these things that you do in small talk to build rapport. And then you move over and you become this robot about collecting data. These two worlds felt so broken and they weren't combined. And I noticed that not only they weren't combined just in general, but they weren't combined in any of the software we were using. So like there was no way to look and see if this person that you are talking to, who most of the time still in the USA today, agents are still pretty localized in their neighborhood, even if they're owned by larger agencies. A lot of them are still grouped geographically. They're still kind of cornerstone. There's an insurance agency on every main street, right? They're still very much a part of these communities, but like nothing that they were doing was, none of the systems were recognizing that, what I like to call center of influence, or like who the people really were. And what's crazy is, as an agent, we need that to build the trust to make the sale. But you know who else needs that? The reinsurance company at the very end of the value chain, because they also want to know human like behavior. They're looking at buying habit. Like when they go to look at their book through their carrier partners, they're going out and spending a lot of money to get data on these people, right? To analyze whether or not, and to put through their own algorithms as to whether or not they're good risk. And so the whole thing feels so broken to me, that the boots on the ground people in the beginning that are in their community, that have this kind of information that's valuable, that they're not collecting it. One, selfishly, so that they can make more money, right? Because the more you know about your customer, the better products you're going to be able to sell them. That's specifically true in insurance, because the more you know the person, the better coverage you can suggest to them, and more accurate that can be. But like, you get into these systems that are available today and they're just robot. It's like, it's a robot database. It's like, here's 1,000 fields. All of it revolves around coverage and or policy and or whatever you think it takes to get to the end of the sale. And by the way, there's a field that says contact, and maybe you get a name, a phone number, and a physical and a mailing address. And that is all that you're collecting about that person, outside of the context of a policy you're selling them.
And the way you'd like, this is like a business 101 type of thing, where you brought up transactional, and the difference is stark, right? Like what you have just described is the difference between a trusted advisor, someone who actually knows, right? Like, and you're in the commercial side, right? Like, so it's inherent upon you to actually know like what this business does, how it operates, what their ethos is around risk management and
Or
culture.
just in general, right? Like, do these guys, have they we did a lot of this, like part of what led to Irys is like human mapping, which was like, we would get these companies that come in and you'd look at the board. And if you didn't do your research, you could have board members or people involved in the company that had previous like fraud claims, and like they build these LLCs and these corps, and then they jump around every time there's something happens, and like they bury themselves down, or they get their mom to sign or become, CEO. And you're like, you can't see, outside of just being selfish and wanting to sell more, but like there's real E&O exposure and not understanding who these people are and how they operate their business. And then you being able to track that over time, which is the other big component. Is like, just because it's true today doesn't mean it's true tomorrow. And it certainly doesn't mean it was true yesterday. So like, how do you look at people their connections, things that they've done in their life over a period of time.
Okay, so there are firms in the space. Some of them are pretty large. We don't have to name names. Why doesn't Margo Giles just engage with one of these firms and says, "Hey, you know, you guys should do better. You should do this. You should be collecting this data." How do you go from this particular problem that you're seeing, and instead of like engaging with the players that are there now, you realize the only way this is going to get done is if I do it.
Oh, so I did. The answer to that is I did very much so. I was a user of all of these. Well, let's talk just in general about the software providers. I was a user of almost every one of these softwares at some point in time, either through acquisition or through like personally using them. And I was a mouthpiece. I mean, anybody that would listen, I would tell that to. But the problem was fundamentally, it's a different system. So, like, they might actually really agree with my ethos and how the system should be built. But you're talking about going into a company and telling them their baby is ugly and you know what I mean? And you
Hmm.
need to change everything about it. And they're like, well, I'm a billion-dollar company, so I don't need to change anything. And I'm still going to be profitable and who cares? And I think we see that in like if you were to gauge the sentiment of most of the agents and brokers in the space about how they feel about the connectivity, the customer support, the product, all of that with what they're using, those things are very, very, very low. And I can't say anything else except for to say there's no financial reason to do so. So why would
Yeah.
they?
So correct me if I'm wrong, because I hear this as a common pain point with many of the pieces of software that agents are using. It seems hard for me to believe, but with a lot of these pieces of software, the agent doesn't actually own the data. Is that
Almost,
true?
yeah.
Is
I
that?
mean, most of these system of records software. So think of like your core platforms. The newer solutions that are coming out that might solve like a problem or two, like they're really, I call them point solutions, but things that they're not the full blown workflows, but they're kind of like pieces that would enhance an agent's life a little bit. Those typically are much more lenient on data, but the core, the big two or three, no, you do not own your data.
Yeah.
And I think a while back, because I'm in a lot of the agency owner groups, a while back, there was some talk in one of the groups about people pulling out the contracts because they didn't believe, we signed the contract, but we're not really reading that fine print. And when you go back and read that fine print, it was the industry standard it is very clear that you do not own the data. And that not only do you not own it, but they have the right to sell it to anybody, anytime.
Hmm.
And if you want any of your data at any time, other than what you can get through their user interface, there will always be fees. And you also can't dictate the format in which you receive that data, which
Yeah.
is another really big problem that people. So I think, look, 15, 20 years ago, I mean, even 30 years ago, that didn't even matter. Like no one was thinking about their data being their business. This word, like it wasn't a thing, right? It was a thing, but it wasn't. But now in 2024, when you're looking at, again, all of these awesome point solutions that are coming up, all of these enhancements that agents can use with AI, with integration, now all of a sudden those things are going to require that you have access to your data. And they require that you have access in a technical way that these additional software companies need to hook into that platform. And it's just not there. And I think so that that rise of them realizing, agents and brokers realizing like, oh, wait a minute, we have to we're being told no in a lot of these scenarios. We can't use this tool because we don't have our data.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah. And so Irys can literally lay claim to like a tagline. Maybe I should get paid for this. I don't know. Um, built by agents for agents, right? Like
I hate
so.
using that tagline though, because
Yeah.
can I tell you that at some point, every one of our competitors has also used that tagline because somewhere in the 1,000-person organization, there's an agent there.
Darn.
Um,
I thought I had
I
something
know,
there.
I know. I got the FUBU reference. I get the FUBU reference there.
But that is an important point. Like you're speaking their language. You have the pain point. So let's get into Irys itself. Where'd the name come from?
This journey to this name has been so long and drawn out. I feel like in this day and age, there is no URL that has not been purchased. There is nothing that you can trademark. I mean, everything has been done. No, but it started with Irys is a messenger goddess on Mount Olympus. And she's not one of the most famous goddesses, but was really critical in delivering information between mortals and gods. And it felt very appropriate. Also, she did it on a rainbow, which definitely, for me, having anything sparkling or bright colored, I'm like, give me anything that doesn't look like insurance at this point in time, right? To shake it up a bit.
Okay. So you went back to your Greek roots
Mm-hmm.
on this, climb Mount Olympus. I love the connection. That's the goddess of information, basically,
Yeah, basically.
as well. So let's talk about the solution. It's not. Is it just for agents, brokers,
Yeah, right
MGAs,
now
or
we're rolling out and have rolled out in the last 12 months to agents and brokers. Brokers meaning wholesale shops and a handful of MGAs as well. So we fit really great in that space. We are rolling out our carrier platform in 25 as well as a benefits platform. So we have a cornerstone partner right now we're building out benefits with because it makes perfect sense to me. And if you look at the way that agencies are actually structured, the way that our software and kind of how we've structured it now, everything's very personal, commercial, benefits. But typically customers traverse those verticals
yeah,
all the time.
yeah,
And I think that's part of the chaos that is an insurance software provider right now is, they're trying to take these very broad strokes and they're trying to model the software after how the insurance agencies are. And still, it drives me nuts, but not thinking about the customer. So it's like
right,
the agency is the customer, so we're going to build towards the agency, but they're missing that underneath the agency is also a client, which I think is a lot of times why we saw for a very long time lack of client portal and self-service software, because all of these providers were very narrow in their scope, that their client was an agency. The other part is that most agencies are just complex. I mean, honestly, maybe they're a scratch agency because they're coming from a captive. Those people have a different set of needs. Maybe they're a small agency that's, but they're part of a private equity firm, right? Like, or they're part of an association now, or they've been purchased by, or they're a big agency and that big agency has, groups and locations and holding companies and roll ups and roll downs. And it's just like, it's funny to me how, also, I'm trying to be nice, how such simple software ingrained itself in enterprises that deserve and should be operating on enterprise level software. And
yeah,
it's almost disguising itself as enterprise software. But if you take a look behind the hood, it's really just a database that was supposed to be a database and never meant to be anything that a non-data scientist was in, right? And then over the years, it's kind of been like Band-Aid and Band-Aid and Band-Aid and Band-Aid to try to make a round peg fit into a square hole. And what you end up with is where we are now, which is even at the largest level, 1,000 Band-Aid solutions all come together. And here's the craziest part is like, because I talk to agents all the time and they're like, you're gonna love this. And they're like, and then they show me 46 vendors, that they're all, and then this vendor, they got a Zapier, but this one's got an API and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, does this work? They're like, well, yeah. I mean, like it works this, and then, well, it kind of works here. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, no way, dude. You sneeze on this thing and it's going down. Like, one of these vendors makes a field change and
yeah.
you're out of luck. That's a full-time job. So it's so funny to me that it's almost like we need a whole new education on tech. And we've been sheltered as agents and brokers because we've been operating again on simple, outdated tech for so long. And it was okay because the tech was, growing and growing and growing. And then you saw COVID and you saw AI, and now all of a sudden the tech is way out here. We've made some huge leaps in technology in the last 36 months, right? As far as the availability of it to everyday consumers. And so now you're not this safety blanket of your legacy, like it's starting to crumble because the agencies that are able to take these tools and utilize them correctly and start to look at those underlying structures and fix them, they're not just 20 or 30% in sales. They're growing by 1,000%, right? Like they're growing in massive ways. And those little agencies that like, I mean, I'm not trying to ring the Armageddon bell, but I would be really shocked in 5 years if you still had the type of productivity for the customers on those systems that you have for customers on anything else, frankly.
Yeah. The inability to communicate must be, I'm as you're describing that, I'm thinking of all of the parallel processes that must be occurring because of some of the things that we talked about, like how much was done in duplication or
All of it.
or triplicate. Like, okay,
Or
not only do
quadruple or more.
we have to enter it into the software because that's like the main thing, but since we can't do this or this, we also have to enter it into Excel so that we can get these other reports or these other things. But we also have to enter it in to the CRM because that's not part of the, oh my God, like it becomes impossible when you circle all the way back to the beginning when you talked about the complexity of the accounts that you were working on. It's like
Yeah.
you cannot be doing, you already have complexity. You
Yeah.
cannot be manufacturing excess complexity so you can just get some simple things done. So Irys gets started.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the value proposition for that. I think we've already hinted all the way around like the data model, who
Yeah.
owns the data. You brought up AI. That would be interesting to understand like how you are thinking about all of the potential productivity gains that can occur with AI. So Irys has like all of these components that have been duct taped and dental flossed all the way around. You're pulling, you're
Putting them
using,
in a cohesive, think of it like an orchestra. And I describe Irys in a way that I don't like, again, not to get on the technical side, but I think it's important for people to understand like the basic level of tech, especially if they're out there buying it or testing it or procuring it or trying to build it, please. But the way that we designed it, your typical insurance technology is monolithic. That means that at the front, the user experience and database are one. We designed it where it's microservice based. And you'll see this a lot in the bigger like in enterprise tech, it's typical to be microservice based, which means that we have this great UI layer. So like the screens and the things you're touching, that's this layer. It sits way up here. And then we call our own API on the back end to our own services. So like maybe it's workflow management, maybe it's DocuSign or eSign, and maybe like whatever, maybe it's certificate management. All of these are microservices that we own that sit underneath the UI layer. So like, why is that important? Well, what it means is my UI can call any service. It may be an Irys service. It may not. It may be one of those point solutions. It may be some ancillary software. It may be something you built internally. It may be a data warehouse, whatever it is. But the user, your agents, your CSRs, your clients, anybody interfacing with Irys is not having that disjointed, crazy jumping from system to system experience, even though they might actually be technically jumping from system to system. So I say that because it has a profound effect on the way you use a software, and it has a profound effect on the flexibility of the software. What it means is if I needed to then, let's say somebody came in 10 years and tells me my baby's ugly. Okay, maybe the certs are bad, or maybe we need to update the database back, or maybe we need whatever it is we need, or the UI itself needs to change. We're not tearing down everything and building it back up. We're able to sort of take those pieces out, update them, change them, and then plug them back into the orchestration of the system. And that is not novel. Okay. This is how software has been built for decades in other industries. It's just not how software has been built in our industry. And so like I love to give that high level, because when you talk about flexibility and not every system, we can't possibly be and we'll never be able to build the perfect system for every use case and every snowflake
Right.
agency scenario, but we don't have to, because of the way that we've constructed it. So we can take those pieces and plug them in when they're necessary, and also deprecate them when they're not necessary anymore. But
Yeah.
the user base is not having to go through these massive trainings and confusion about what they're supposed to do next.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
That reminds me of a conversation I had with a large carrier technologist who was talking about policy management systems for carriers and saying like, a lot of these policy management system companies had to, they always wanted to make sure that they had the next the bells and whistles in there so they could increase the perceived value of their software. So he talked about payments, and he's like, Nick, the problem is not that they don't have a payment system. They have a payment system, but they're not experts at
Yeah.
payments. This is something they shoehorned in just so they can say they have a payment system.
Yeah.
But like in the last 10 years, fintech has exploded. And so
Huge.
payments is like a completely different beast. How far along before we're talking about digital currencies being able
We're
to do
talking
that?
about, we're having those discussions right now with providers. Like right now, we're having those discussions.
And so it almost has to be constructed the way technology is advancing at different speeds and paces
Mhm.
around some of these different pain points. You almost have to construct it in this microservice type of environment because it's impossible to be an expert
Well,
in
and it also
some of these
means
critical
that
areas.
we don't have to be the payment expert.
Right, right.
Irys doesn't have, in order for Irys to deliver that experience to our clients, we don't have to build it and we don't have to be the expert at it. We can partner with people that are already in market doing the crazy things that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on building, but we can still utilize that in our system and offer it to our clients. And that's part of our process of growth. And that applies to, by the way, again, to get a little technical, but there are parts and features and functions of basic software that no software provider that's providing core tech or the level, because this is a big piece of software. This is not a little widget that we built for, your Google
Mhm.
like this is a huge piece of software. There are pieces and parts that we as Irys and any of my competitors I know have built from scratch that they should have never built, because there's already compute and data and things that exist out there in the marketplace that are eons beyond what your small AMS engineering team is ever going to be able to build. So when we tried, this is not pie in the sky. I failed at this for many years. I have built this system so many times and rebuilt it and torn it down and lost and won and lost. I mean, 1,000 million times, right? And we'll continue to do that. But part of me going through that process was figuring out how to architect something that was resilient to change, because there is no scenario where our system is not going to have to change. If we want to,
Right.
I mean, we're going to have to expand and contract. And so when we brought on experts and system architects, I was really diligent with them about how do we build an infrastructure for today, but knowing what we like and looking at what's coming 15 years from now, like cryptocurrency and potentially blockchain and smart contract. Like, how do we build an infrastructure that we're not having to tear down when those things are here and the market is ready for them? Which
Yeah.
again is not something that we're requiring of our current software providers. They're not having those conversations. Like, there's no innovation lab coming up with all these things in our current providers. Like,
Yeah.
it's not happening. And so it's really critical, I think, for people when they're, especially even like small to mid agencies where you don't have necessarily IT departments on hand or software developers that work for you that can go through and ask these kinds of questions when you're looking to buy or upgrade or implement any kind of software. Like, we should be asking that question. How are you preparing for the future, because the last thing a small agency needs to do is come back in and rip something out and have to put something else in because they can't keep up. That's detrimental to
Yeah.
those
And
companies.
and it would be foolish to think that technology is not going to continue to evolve the way it
Going
has, like
fast.
it just in the past year with AI,
Yeah,
and I'm literally using it every single day now.
me
Like
too. Yeah.
like there's not too many things where I'm not thinking about like how can I implement this. That's one thing. And the other that's quietly bubbling to the surface is quantum computing,
Yes.
right? Which means that literally everything is going to have to be rewritten for that type of computing, but that could exponentially, along with AI, increase productivity. So I want to come kind of circle all the way back and kind of end with a few minutes that we have left, talk about Florida
Yeah.
itself. Irys is selling nationwide, but you're a Floridian. Irys
Hmm.
is based in Tampa, in the Tampa area, right? And you know firsthand the complexities of the Florida market. You talked about from the commercial side, but the agents and brokers and wholesalers and MGAs that you're dealing with, Florida is very unique in that because of the catastrophes, because of the complexities, there really isn't a soft market time. There really isn't a
We're
moment in
always in
time,
a hard market. Like
right?
some are just worse than others, right?
Yeah. Or like you still have to kind of shotgun that approach. So the
Yeah.
complexity is always going to be there. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about Irys specifically for Florida-based agents, brokers, MGAs, wholesalers, and soon you said carriers
Yep.
who are just like, I mean, you talk to them every single day. I'm talking to them most days. They're pulling their hairs out
Yep.
and having to deal with their insurance buyers through this particular process, which is incredibly difficult. Talk about the productivity that can occur by using something like Irys. And this, I think we bring it home. Like this is your baby
Yeah.
dealing with the complexity you had to deal with when you started.
So this is where we plug, like this is one of the first places we used AI and we prototyped AI, because when you're in Florida, you're right. We don't, like, typically you don't have 3 or 4 carriers that you go to religiously and that's your agency makeup. We have, oh my God, we're close to 100 between brokers and all of the different intermediaries that we're contacting on any given time through our agency network that we own. And so the number one problem I ran into was appetite. Who is writing what I need to write right now? And appetite in Florida is changing every single day. And so the first thing that pissed me off when I got into the agent seat and I was looking at the software was like, oh, cool. You're going to, sales rep will send me an email and give me the appetite guide. It's in a PDF format, which I can't do anything with. Right. And half the time it's wildly incorrect, right? They're like, oh, we want construction, and you send them 100 constructions and you get 99 declines. And you're like, what are you talking about? Like, well, we don't really want that. We really want a safe office risk. And you're like, you and
Mhm.
everyone else in the
Yeah.
world, right? I don't have a problem placing that kind of stuff. So when it comes to appetite, there has been a distrust created between providers and us and the distribution channel, because either times get tough and they shut us down, or they close down markets, or they reduce commissions, and that's always like we're kind of on the last to know list. And meanwhile, we've been out sort of we've got a stack of 100 quotes that need to go out, and we were going to take them to this carrier, but guess what? Now they're out of the market. So now where are we supposed to go? So one of the things that we started to do with Irys, like, and it ended up feeding into how we built the entire back end, but I wanted to be able to collect enough data about risk as it was being quoted, whether it was declined or not, if it was changing coverage from quote submission to quote. Like, I needed all of this really rich data to feed into an AI so that we could, as an agency, look at a machine learning model and say, okay, if you're doing a church in this zip code, then historically this agency has placed it with these carriers,
Yeah.
and here's why, and here's how long it takes, and this is the process. And that as my CSRs or my marketing folks and sales are going to create these things, they're getting that information in real time. Because even if we send it to an email, right, or we made a beautiful report that went to a manager, that still is not getting to the boots on the ground people who are actually doing that work. And we saw that disconnect. So first we started with okay, we'll send an email and we'll alert them when a market is available, or we'll alert them. But even that had a disconnect. And so we said, no, we actually need to embed it in the workflow itself. So as you're typing into the system, it's telling you where to go before you waste your time on like a wild goose chase. So it's looking at historical data and doing that predictive analytics around market. That's sort of version 1. Version 2 is with the addition of carriers, having them give us real-time, true API-driven appetite so that they can control what agents are sending to them, because they also don't want to receive 1,000 submissions that they can, right? They don't want that either. I don't want it. They don't want it. Why are we not talking about it? It's crazy. But being able to ingest that and in real time shape that algorithm, so it's not just where you placed it historically, now it's where the carrier wants you to place it. And then the way that we constructed Irys is we can look at the machine learning, the AI module can actually look at all of Irys, and it can start to train on all subsets of Irys, whether you're an agent in Florida or Oklahoma or whatever. And we can start to give those users real-time insights to even places they're not appointed with. Because the other big part was appointment management and knowing, okay, all of a sudden now who was the State Farm or somebody in Florida started writing, and I was like, why are we losing to State Farm all the time? And all of a sudden they come into the market, or you have a new carrier come into the market. There's somebody in your agency needs to be paying attention to sort of market dynamics. But again, that's been a very manual process that doesn't always make its way down to the people that are actually going and taking submissions to the client portal or to the rater, right? And don't get me started on comparative raters in Florida. But so we had to figure out a way not only to get historical and to route our users to the correct place so they didn't waste their time quoting 5 places that were going to be unfruitful for them, but then how do we look at that holistically for everyone in this demographic and then give them those pushes towards, hey, there's a new market in your area that you're not appointed with, you need to contact this. And then going to like we've been talking to carriers now about doing like just-in-time appointments, especially on some of the E&S stuff. Like send the quote over, they look at it like, yeah, I kind of want it. They click the button on Irys's side, you're able to then push that through, and now you're going through the appointment process electronically. That is the stuff that I bring to Irys that I feel is very Florida-esque, because that's not as exciting to maybe a Midwest agency that's had the same 4 carriers, but it's a big deal for Florida markets. And it's also a big deal for larger agencies that are going through M&A. If they're out actively buying agencies in other regions and they need help.
Sure.
So we use it in a way sometimes where agencies can be directed to certain carriers if that's what the parent agency is looking for them to do, so they can work towards contingent and stuff like that. So there's a lot of applications for it, but that was the first thing that my Florida girl internal was like, we need to figure out how to redirect appetite and make that easier on the actual poor CSR in most cases that's sitting there that's quoting 5 places that they get 4 declines from.
Pulling their hair out.
Yeah.
Pulling their hair out. Yeah, we've seen it. So Irys, built by agents for agents.
You can I'll let you do that one this time. Yes.
I'm going to trademark that. Of course, it's not going to be worth anything
that's
now.
definitely taken. I guarantee.
Margo, when I bring up your name to people and I say she's a force of nature, no one disagrees. Thank you for your time. You are based off of the helicopter ride story, which I will link to in this. You are the Madonna of insurance. So
love it.
I'm so appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Dick.